Hey everybody, today is Monday, November 4th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, from Superman, the Christopher Reeve Story, editor Otto Burnham.
They liked the idea of having two timelines. Chris's journey from experiencing the accident and his gradual personal transformation from what am I going to do with my life into like, how can I change the way that the world sees people with a disability? Having those coming in was simultaneously very, very exciting as an editor, but also like daunting as well, because it was always like, oh my God, what's on these tapes? The ambition has always been, let's do as much as we can with whatever we can get and craft a big, exciting, emotional, cinematic movie.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Monday again. Nobody likes Mondays. That's why I release this podcast on Mondays. Hopefully it's something you look forward to and it eases the pain of a new work week or eases the pain of a no work week. Plenty of that to go around these days as well. Now think back, if you can, all the way to January. Back in January, you may recall I was at the Sundance Film Festival doing interviews with editors. But unlike this, it was outside, in the elements. I contracted pneumonia. It was awesome. Spoiler alert, I will not be doing that again anytime soon. But at that time, I interviewed probably 20 plus editors. I think there were some sound people in there, maybe a composer or two. We learned a lot. We laughed a lot. But it was kind of like speed dating. The situation is that you have about 10 minutes to talk to an editor you've never met before about a film you've never seen before. So it is a blitz of all these different people and all these different films that are pretty much unfamiliar to you. And you just barely scratch the surface of getting to know them. The cool thing about Sundance is, all these movies, eventually they make their way into the theater-going world at large. And as fate would have it, a bunch of those movies from the festival have recently started to pop. One of those films is the documentary Superman, the Christopher Reeve Story. It got a lot of buzz at the festival and later on with the critics. Earlier this year, it had a limited release in theaters, but the buzz grew, and then it came back into the theaters. And then it went away. But the buzz was still there, so it came back again into theaters. This film would just not give up. And that is definitely the kind of film we want to celebrate and explore here on the show. The editor of this film, who braved the elements with me back in Park City, is Otto Burnham. A terrific editor and a delightful fellow, if I may say so. And I'm thrilled to have the chance to get to know Otto more and have a proper discussion with him now that I've actually seen the film. Hopefully you've seen it as well. If you haven't, it should be out on Max, I believe, sometime soon. And if you are a member of ACE, well, good for you, hotshot. I'm happy to tell you that the film is on the ACE screening app. Give it a watch and maybe give it a vote when the time comes. Now, I'm not going to get into what the film is all about. I think it explains itself, and Otto will certainly give you all the info you really need in just a minute or two. First, I just got to tell you about a super way for you to make sure your next film or TV show sounds its very best. And that is with production audio from Extreme Music, of course. For over 20 years, they have been providing content creators in the world of media and entertainment amazing audio created by the top names in music production and composing. Names like Trent Reznor, Michael Giacchino, Quincy Jones, Snoop Dogg, and so many more. All you gotta do to get these great production audio tracks is to go visit their website, extrememusic.com, and search on just about every aspect of music you can think of. You can even give them a reference track and say, hey, Extreme Music, find me something like this. And you know what? They will. That's just the kind of benevolent geniuses they are. On top of that, their impressive catalog of tunes is customizable right down to the length and instrumentation so that you get the sound that you want in a way that suits your story best. There's no cost to just give it a try, and as far as the licensing goes, you can take care of all that stuff online, or they could have one of their reps help guide you through it. So for your next media making mission, scripted, unscripted, or somewhere in between, be sure to visit extrememusic.com. All right then, we got a new guy to meet on the show. I love that. Checking in from Soho to talk about Superman, the Christopher Reeve Story, here's editor Otto Burnham. It's funny, I went back and I watched our interview from Sundance. It's just like, oh my God, that's awful. Like, I'm never doing that again.
It was very in the wild, wasn't it?
If you wanted au naturel, that's what you got. So the last time we spoke, we barely had time to talk much about the film itself, let alone you and your career. So now that we have that time, that's kind of where I'd like to begin with you. You have a very diverse background that includes, among other things, an Ace Eddie Award for your work on Formula One Drive to Survive. So tell me about how you got your start with your editing career.
I mean, I guess it really depends on how far we want to go back. I didn't study film. I studied psychology at university, but was a big cinephile. Lots of foreign films, lots of anime, lots of like Japanese and French cinema, but big on the popcorn blockbuster kind of experience. Like I loved going to the movies, as well as the sort of, late night VHS sessions and recording films on VHS when I was growing up and all the rest of it. I guess the start of the journey was actually interning at a post-production facility in Los Angeles back in the day, a facility that my uncle ran at the time of the transition from film to digital. So I was working in a place which was like pretty much among the first, we were certainly doing the first tapeless workflow at that time, the workflow that was applied on Zodiac and Curious Case for Benjamin Button, that kind of era. And I was there, kind of on and off and like very much like, earning my stripes, making cups of tea and all the rest of it. And I moved back to London and I was kind of climbing the greasy rungs of post-production for 7 years, full tape op. But I'd come back like a kind of, no one cared about digital in London at that point, right? Like literally no one cared. And it took, I think 3 years for like P2. I'd been working on uncompressed 444 recording, and it took like 2 or 3 years before P2 recording even really like hit the UK. But I was an expert in Final Cut Pro, I have to say. but it got me a job, and I worked at a post production facility. Avid was the main player, and I learned Avid, and obviously like probably I think maybe a lot of editors. What the facility gave me was the opportunity to be around documentaries as an assistant, but also to use the equipment after hours, cutting music videos, like short films, anything I could get my hands on. And when the post-production facility went under, I made the transition. I like jumped to being freelance from like a junior editor kind of position. And it went from there, really.
Well, there's been times over the years, Otto, that I've considered renaming the podcast from The Rough Cut to something else. I think Greasy Rungs of Post-Production might be a new candidate.
Well, it is. It's tough, man. It's tough getting out of that machine room, right? Like, it's hard. Long hours, weekend shifts, night shifts. It's a killer. But I do know lots of people that was their route in, and I was amongst them,
So from there, you went on to do a lot of great things, including, as I mentioned, winning an Eddie Award for Formula One Drive to Survive. For this film, it's not your first time working with producer-directors Ian Bonnot and Peter Attegi. You've done a few doc films and a docu-series with them. Tell me about going back to the beginning with them, meeting them, how you started working together, and what it was that made you all a good fit for one another.
My first time working with Peter and Ian was on a documentary feature called McQueen. I came on and helped them in the edit for 6 to 8 weeks. They had an editor, a lovely lady called Cinzia, who was the main editor, and they just were bogged down with an enormous amount of archive and a running amount of time. But in the small amount of time that I spent working with them, you could feel like an alchemy between myself and Ian and between myself and Peter. And when it came round to 3 years later, having stayed in contact, they approached me with the idea of a documentary about the Paralympics, the story of the history of the Paralympics, which ended up being called Rising Phoenix. I just jumped at the chance to work with them again, or work with them really properly for an extent, for an entire movie. That went very well and picked up some awards for that, and beautiful, very, very engaging film, very moving film about people's journey from usually like overcoming some kind of accident that happened in their life, or potentially maybe someone who'd found themselves told they couldn't do the things they wanted to do because they had grown up in a place or in a country where wheelchair users were thought about in a certain way and thought less than, and they became these like sporting heroes who just blow your mind in terms of their sporting achievement, like brilliant set of athletes, amazing human beings. And so Rising Phoenix, and then we went into the same kind of like, gestational period where we stayed in touch. And then I was actually rollerblading with Ian Bonnot, having a nice conversation. And he told me that they'd found their next project and they were going to be making a film about Christopher Reeve. And actually the words he used was, I'm directing the next Superman movie, which I loved because like that was just a cute incentive to try and get me to do it. Anyway, like I knew Christopher Reeve, like he was my Superman growing up, and obviously the combination of that, the comic book angle and the opportunity to work with Peter and Ian again was just like, I just couldn't say no.
Once you got down to business about doing Christopher Reeve's story, what did they say to you about what they wanted to achieve with it?
Well, that's a good question. I think everything that I've worked on with Peter and Ian and Misfits, Ian's company, has always been independent film. Like, it's always been kind of like independently financed, and the ambition has always been the moon, basically. Like, it's always been, let's do as much as we can with whatever we can get and craft a big, exciting, emotional, cinematic movie. That's always the ambition, to make a movie. Like, not even like, let's make a documentary. It's like, let's make a movie out of this story. And that's what I know always their approach going into this is. But actually, quite early on, they had said that their ambition for this was that no pressure, that really Sundance was what they were shooting for. And Sundance was really what they were hoping was going to be the launch pad for the film. And that was like the kind of, the target on the wall when we started the project.
Well, speaking of Sundance, when we talked at Sundance, I believe you said that Peter wrote the story before you started. And that is a concept, the concept of writing for something that is unscripted. That can be confusing for people because how can there be a writer? It's unscripted. And ultimately, you would also end up being credited as a writer on the film. What exactly had Peter written, and how does that writing translate into how you make the film?
So Peter Otegi is like a genius, I'll say it. A very, very talented writer. And it is, I have to say, there have been some people who have questioned the notion of there even being a writer on a unscripted project. But I guess I would say once you've worked with Peter, you would understand why. I mean, basically, Peter and Ian together, and Misfits and Passion Pictures during the development of the film, came up with the idea of starting the film with Chris's accident, or as close to the beginning of the film with the accident. And then they liked the idea of having two timelines, essentially. Chris's journey from experiencing the accident and all of the drama and the heartache that came with that, and his gradual personal transformation from what am I going to do with my life into like, how can I change the world for people like me and change the way that the world sees people with a disability. That being one timeline, and another timeline being essentially the journey of Christopher before the accident. So how did he become an actor, getting his role as an unknown actor as Superman, and what happened to his career beyond then, his first marriage, the birth of his children, and so these kind of big landmark moments that any biography you would want. But their ambition was always, how can we set two storylines running and interact between the two? That was always the ambition, and that was the kind of story outline that they gave to me when I started the project, basically.
Since you do have a writing credit as well, is that just a given that as an unscripted editor, a doc editor, you are also writing the story, or is there something specific about your contributions to this film that would ultimately determine your name should be in the credits as co-writer?
It's not a given that if you work as an editor on an unscripted project that you get, or maybe are entitled to a writing credit or a co-writing credit like I got for Superman. I think there are instances where there's probably some editors who deserve them and don't get them. And I think there's some projects where maybe it wouldn't be necessary or the editor wouldn't want them. I feel like I should say, like, I never asked for the credit. It was given to me, and I was quite surprised by it, but pleasantly surprised, because while the story outline had been written and certain moments within Chris's life had been identified, the story is obviously like very flexible within the edit. And like, there are parts of Superman which I should say, probably came up with in the edit. And it's like, there's different types of editing where you can kind of get paper transcripts of everything. I've done them. I've done those jobs where like you're working with an edit producer who's kind of like, writing the story to one side, you writing voiceover, kind of, handing you those things, and then you're working out the way to like how to elevate the specific story as best you can. But when I work with Peter and Ian, they're obviously very supportive within the the story process and the crafting of the story once we're all working together. But there are long stretches where I'm just making this stuff up, right? And they give me the space to do that. And that's actually one of the reasons that I love working with them so much, is they trust me to try and make kind of vertical slices, for want of a better word, of the film as I see it, kind of regardless of like what maybe the story outline will be or what I think the story needs. And I'm telling the story through my own exploration of the archive and interviews, sometimes in ways that they may well not have intended, you know.
Well, you said you were pleasantly surprised to see your credit as co-writer. I was pleasantly surprised to see your credit as editor to be the first one after Ian and Peter's credit as directors. Did that surprise you as well, or is that always how it goes on the projects you've got?
I have to say it's not always how it goes. And again, obviously I'm incredibly appreciative that they think of me like that, right? I didn't ask for my credit to be there, but what I would say is those two are very close. They've got like an amazing working dynamic, but as a three, we have an amazing working dynamic. There's lots of people that contribute towards Superman, but obviously there is a lovely brief period of time where you are, along with, I should say, Emiliano Lopez, my assistant editor, where you're all in the edit together and you all feel like you're in this together and making this thing together. It was a surprise, but I really appreciated it, basically.
Something that surprised me, and I don't know why, but the first thing that really hit me in watching the film was the DC Studios logo. It made me wonder how closely they were involved in the process beyond distribution, if at all.
I have to say that DC Studios have been like amazing partners, and they have like backed the film to the hilt in a way that certainly has like surpassed my own like expectations, and they've just been brilliant to work with. But I should also say that they had like no kind of creative control or input. They didn't ask us to change a frame after they saw it at Sundance, which was the first time they saw it. So they've been great, but they weren't involved in the editorial at all.
Were all the interviews shot by the time you joined? And if not, were you able to have any input or involvement yourself into that process so that you knew you had everything you might need to tell this story?
So I believe Peter and Ian had filmed the interviews with Christopher's children, and obviously they gave raw, emotional, very, very vulnerable interviews, and those had been shot. And I believe some of the interviews with some of Chris's closest friends at the time had been shot, but there were interviews that were coming in during the edit. And one thing that, again, I really appreciate about their process is that while I don't read all of their questions, they always ask me if there was anything that I want asked.
Encapsulating a man's life into a movie is not easy. Among the many questions you have to answer is where to begin. Where you actually begin is a quote from Christopher about what he'd like to accomplish in the next 20 to 30 years, which was really powerful because he talks about wanting to be taken seriously as an actor and just even thinking about the next 20 to 30 years of my life when we as an audience know those aren't coming. A very powerful way to begin. Tell me about just what you went through to get to that place and all the things you considered and how you start off a movie like this.
It's a very good question. There was several versions of the opening of the film, and some started a little more slowly and actually, started with the story the other way around. So, you started with, the slow reveal of this man who was put into his wheelchair and, met the dog on his way out on the morning and, had to go through some of the medical things that Chris had to go through. And that was intercut with these flashes of these memories of him as Superman. So that was like one example of it. But we ended up, rightly, I think, coming down on the side of, I guess, just like giving you Superman from the beginning. And I thought the best way to do that would be to use John Williams' score, which is obviously incredibly iconic, but also provides a kind of real sense of like anticipation at the beginning of it. And in using quick editing and kind of having black spaces between the music, it felt like that was a real way of like, oh yeah, come on, I'm ready for this. That's how I wanted people to feel, certainly at the, as the curtain sort of comes up at the beginning of the film. And then it was really just a question of like, who was Chris? Where was he at the moment in time where his accident was about to happen, which was like, he was Superman, he'd been super successful, he still had so much that he wanted to achieve, but he also had this like incredible scene where they blow out the candles New Year's Eve, I think, 7 months before Chris has his accident, and they make a wish about what you want to happen, and then what happens is like this moment that changes his life. And that just felt like obviously really emotional but very poetic as well.
Yeah, those are two good ways of describing this movie throughout, emotional and poetic. With a lot of docs, the challenge can be procuring or creating media. This one seems like the more challenging aspect would be just sorting through the massive amount of media that could be made available to you. So what was your process for organizing all this different media, the stuff you shot, all the archival stuff, all the legacy material? How did you bring that all together in terms of how you tagged it and organized it so that you could begin to find the story within the edit?
It was myself and Emiliano watching a hell of a lot of archive, basically, because the family had very kindly opened up the family vault. So we had all of Chris's childhood, we had, lots of home video. And then apart from all of his sort of big celebrity interviews on talk shows, there was just endless commercial archive. But I had to just listen to it. We didn't trint it or anything like that. I just would sit and listen. And if something made me laugh, then I would log it, or if he talked about a specific film, even though I didn't know which films were going to be relevant. Obviously, Superman we knew was going to be, but Chris had a very long career. And, I went through and marked it all. And then it took some time to kind of do that for the archive as well as the interviews. And what I was left with when I kind of really sat down to actually work on the story, which was probably after about a month of like logging everything, was all these little callbacks I could use. If I needed to find, a moment where he talked about Remains of the Day, I could search for Remains of the Day and I would have everything that I thought was interesting about that particular thing. And it gives people the willies at the beginning because they think you're not doing anything. But at the same time, you can call back on this stuff when you're like, do you know what I mean? 2 a.m. at the back end of the project. And you're like, let me just search joke and let's find something. Do you know what I mean? It helped for that. One thing I should say is that Matt Feury, Christopher's eldest son, actually filmed his dad observationally between 2001 and 2004. And those tapes we'd heard rumours of at the beginning of the project, but actually those didn't start coming in and weren't digitised and logged until the project was actually going. And having those coming in was simultaneously very, very exciting as an editor, but also like daunting as well, because it was always like, oh my God, what's on these tapes? Where do we have to move and shift the story accordingly? What do we have to maybe bring back? We took away because now we can do it much more effectively. And it got pretty hairy at times. But some of the sequences in the film, like where Chris moves for the first time, I think in 7 years, I think it was, he moves his finger and then he's in his swimming pool and he moves his legs for the first time. All that stuff just opened up massively because suddenly we were presented with this incredibly rich emotional archive.
So that material that Matthew shot, was that the foundation of his VO? Because, and this is just my observation, you can tell me if you think I'm off base, but to me, the film is really anchored by his voiceover and not the talking head interviews. Like he tells the story and they provide the color. Were those VO elements from Christopher Reeve? Was that stuff that Matthew shot?
That's a very good question. And I've been asked this question a lot. One thing that we were very, very fortunate about was that Chris was a very smart man and a real orator. He worked in the theatre and was super bright and he could write. And after his accident, he wrote 2 books. And those books were actually presented not in their full form, but he actually did audiobook versions of them. So it gave you the emotional state of various points of his life after the accident. And it helped us unlock the trajectory of him feeling like, what am I going to do with myself? I'm looking back at all these things that I wish I could still be able to do, all the way to kind of resolving itself with, I now see my life not as before and after the accident, but as one entire life. I feel like we employed it in a really amazing way, but at the same time, we were very fortunate that some of the voiceover did come from commercial archive, but the vast majority of it was from Still Me and Nothing Is Impossible.
Do you start laying out the story with the interviews first, getting that into place, and then support it with the archival footage?
I mean, I have to say, I don't really like the kind of radio play building the entire story of master interviews. I mean, I sort of do for certain story beats. So, when I first started cutting the film, I would make a Superman 1 beat, a Superman 2 beat, a Chris becomes famous overnight beat, a Chris's first relationship, Chris is having children, and I make little films. Basically, I just concentrate on whatever area of the story that I want to kind of create a moment for, and I create that moment. And sometimes it's archive led because I found something that I think, I can get really creative with that. And sometimes it's master interview based. It really just depends with what sort of gets my juices flowing at that moment in time. And then the hard work is then sort of maintaining the essence of those, but also stitching them together as you try and build the whole thing together,
Well, something that I discovered going back and looking at our Sundance interview, you had talked about going through the process of set dressing the edit with archive and then sort of subtracting the master interviews, almost sort of like laying it all fat and then just chiseling away till it gets to its essence, which I thought was pretty eloquent for a man who had snow blowing in his face at the time.
You know what? I'd probably say that, budgetary concerns aside, documentaries built entirely around evidence, and if you can have it from the person that you're trying to tell something about, or if a piece of archive can do what two master interviews have to do in a shorter amount of time, I usually always come down on the side of the archive, right? That's why we're all here. And that is that process of subtraction, it's like, and it's just, sometimes you don't find those at the beginning. Sometimes you might build an entire sequence around it, but sometimes you may well stumble across something that you didn't understand the application before 6 months down the line. And then I'm like, get rid of the master interview. Let's just use this. Well, I mean, it's a toss up, right? Obviously it's not just about information. It's about what's the most emotional way of delivering that story beat.
The audience comes into this knowing a lot about Christopher Reeve already because of his celebrity. You don't spend a ton of time in his childhood, but that is one area where I think you really reveal a lot to the audience they never knew before. One of those things is his father was just not a great guy, and his home life wasn't really great growing up. Where does one find footage of Franklin Reeve being interviewed about his son? Because I didn't know who Franklin Reeve was before this, and you have archival footage of Christopher Reeve's dad talking about being disappointed in his son, which is remarkable.
So half of the fun with documentary, and regardless of the projects you're working on, are this, what we like to call them nuggets, like archive nuggets in the edit. I don't know how they managed to find them, but the archive team did an incredible job. And that was really, because at one point we were thinking, do we even kind of visually show Franklin? Because maybe it would just be photos. Maybe he's just kind of a looming presence. And I should say, obviously, that Franklin and Chris had like a complicated relationship, and like beyond the accident, I think they did reconnect. That would be an example where someone can tell you that story in an interview, but if you can actually see it for yourself, it's just, it's a gift,
You have a massive amount of archival material, as we've just established, and interviews at your disposal. So making original material is not the necessity it can be in other docs, but you do have this one visual element that is used to support the different turns that Christopher's life takes. It's sort of like a statue of him floating in space, and sort of felt like the space visuals in Superman. But then when I was doing a little more research on you for this interview, it's also something you kind of did in McQueen, where you have this sort of green crystal skull floating and then things just sort of develop on it. For example, in Superman, there's the statue, and then when there's times when he's ailing, you see kryptonite growing on the torso to represent the times his body is failing him. I just thought the whole visual treatment was fascinating, and I wanted to know, A, the process of discovering and creating that, and B, did you think about McQueen or anything that you did in McQueen when you were doing this?
I have to say, I have to land the conception of the statue of the floating kind of image of Chris, in the nebula, firmly at the feet of Peter and Ian, because they came up with that for McQueen, and they actually used CGI in Rising Phoenix that we did together, and they wanted to employ it again on this, and their graphics department did an amazing job. But Peter and Ian had this idea of kind of inner space and outer space, and this idea of this Superman-esque frozen image. And as Chris said in his book Still Me, he felt frozen inside his new reality. So there was lots going on there, but I had some part to play when it came with what I felt like the body should be doing at certain times, either like rising or falling, or kind of just to kind of fit around the emotional state of the narrative. But like the kryptonite, the textures, like it being in space, and the image of Chris itself, that was Peter and Ian's idea, and their very clever idea, I should add.
I know it's going back a ways, but do you recall anything in particular where one little element really did take the story in a different direction or added new concepts that you hadn't considered in the first place?
The one that kind of immediately springs to mind is the scene where we are looking at home video archive, and you see on the television screen a horse riding accident with someone jumping over a fence and a rider falling off and landing on the floor and standing up and being ultimately okay. And the camera slowly panning back from this to reveal Chris and his son Will watching this. And this was actually on New Year's Day of the year that he had his accident. Obviously, dramatic irony aside, like I was struck by how sort of spooky that was in terms of like a foreshadow with what was to come. And that really informed an idea for a slightly hallucinatory sort of delirious sequence as described by his children when they first went to go and see Chris in the hospital after his accident. They said that he was kind of reliving the moment again and again, and in a slightly delirious state, because obviously he was very, very, very unwell at the time, and they weren't actually sure he was going to make it. And then I'd listened to Chris talk about reliving the accident again and again in the years after, and kind of wanting to scream at himself, why didn't I put my hands down to break my fall? And that being like such an emotional thought and something that he carried around with him as a frustration for many years afterwards. That mixed with finding footage of Chris in the film Rear Window, where this is after acting after the accident, lying in a hospital bed and being woken up by thunder and lightning and someone arguing upstairs. Those elements, I suddenly thought we can have Chris in his hospital bed living this nightmarish reliving of the accident, and kind of topped off with this kind of very surreal image of, is that the accident? Oh no, it's Chris watching the accident. What's going on here? You know, kind of fever dream. I mean, that's one example of it, right? Kind of just like piecing all of these disparate nuggets in their own right and kind of trying to create something cinematic out of it.
I guess this is the same scene that I'm about to ask about. I had a note about the scene of Chris lying in a hospital bed, and it's very dreamlike. And you hear all these quotes from him talking about what you're just saying, but they're kind of overlapping. It is very dreamlike, and it reminded me of the scene in Superman when he's flying around the earth trying to reverse time, and you're hearing Jor-El saying, "It is forbidden to interfere." When I'm watching that scene, if we're talking about the same thing, did you think about that at all, or was it just literally something from whole cloth that you made?
I like that expression, whole cloth. I have to say that I didn't take inspiration for Superman from that, but that's the scene which is just slightly before the one that I was talking about. But that being said, it does feed that scene. It's just there's some interviews between it. But yeah, Chris wakes up and he had all of these like really conflicted emotions about, you know, not being able to do anything again, not being able to like, you know, play with his son again, not being able to dance with Dana again, and like not being able to just live his life how he lived it. And I just thought, waking up and finding yourself in a hospital bed and like running through those thoughts in your mind would be really, really overwhelming. And those thoughts would collide and they wouldn't go away and they would overlap. And I wanted it to feel very intense. And so that was the motivation. If it feels like a kind of throwback to Superman, that is like a very, very happy accident and a cool one, because I do know the scene very well. Like, you know, the reversing time, I was desperate to get some of those Superman flying shots into the film because, you know, reversing the earth and then obviously with Jor-El's voice in the background, it's like, you know, it's a very cool scene.
Obviously, you come into this knowing something very bad is going to happen to him, and it's just a matter of when do we get to that, and when is there going to be some kind of mention of horse riding or the accident itself. And in terms of sound design, I think the first time there was any kind of real noticeable sting was when there was some mention, some foreshadowing of horse riding being brought up in the beginning.
Actually, this is probably a good example of where Ilan Eshkeri, who composed the music of Superman, you could feel the turn from the warm family state and the happy life and the challenge of horse riding and the excitement that horse riding had brought to Chris's life turn into kind of a slightly sort of dark kind of nightmare, you know, like it's the pivot on which his entire life hinged, you know, talking about it from like an editorial standpoint. And like, it's a really critical point in the film, but, you know, we wanted to do it very early, because so much happens before that and obviously so much happens after it. And actually, it's the thing that, interestingly, you know, someone actually said to me, it's interesting because I felt like I knew two things about Superman. One was that he was Superman, and two, that was that he had this horse riding accident. Outside that, like, actually, this was an English person said, there wasn't actually that much detail I knew outside that. So to have all of that happen within like the first 7-8 minutes of the film, it actually meant that I went on a romp of like, oh, I don't know where this is going now, but it feels really compelling. And that was really cool, rather than building up to something that you know is going to happen. One of the reasons that I think the film has resonated with so many people is that it's rooted in family drama. And despite Chris's brilliance and his success, he was a human being. And we all share the same doubts. We all have the same emotions. We all, you know, have the same failings. And I think it was really important to convey his journey as a dad and as a partner, and to do all the things that, you know, all of us worry about. And, you know, he's a human being.
You brought up Ilan. This is your second film, I believe, with him. I think you did Kingdom of Dreams together. That is something else you brought up in our discussion earlier, is just the back and forth, the process you two had together, and that his music really helped inform the storytelling decisions that you made at certain times. Can you give me some examples of that?
I think I kind of, probably to, you know, most composers, a fair enough annoyance. I tempt score, right? Like I use a lot of temp score, and like I try not to use kind of like, you know, big, overly known and hard to replace kind of things, but inevitably like people do get used to the temp. And I think one of the things that Ilan brought so successfully to the film was that he just took everything to another level. Or we'd sit and have a spotting scene, and I'd tell him that this is what I wanted the scene to convey, and he would watch it and he's like, yeah, I get it, but like it's not doing that because like the music's not doing that in this place in the right way. And like I was just like, you know, take it away, man. Like, and obviously he just like completely knocked it out of the park. So I think probably that would be like the best way to describe. One example may well be when Chris starts to regain some of his movement for the first time. Initially, I had something that was probably like slightly more kind of like classical and dreamy and floaty over that sequence. And Alan was actually thinking, you know what, like, why don't we like call back something that we used earlier that was more to do with like, you know, him training for Superman and him getting ready to train. And like that was the kind of like storytelling influence he had, you know. I have to say that was one of the moments that Peter Etegi, that was one of the moments that he had kind of like visualized going into it, was Chris being at Kessler Rehabilitation thinking, you know, how am I going to get myself out of this situation? And him training his way out of the chair, and think about all the work that he did when he was training for Superman, when he had to go from someone who was tall and had stature, but was actually quite slim in build and had to put on all this muscle. And, you know, those kind of like, you know, emotional connections. I love that moment, right? Like, I love the way the music punches through. I love the cut. I love the set dressing of that. I love that moment.
Obviously, in documentaries, you have to rely on, I guess, tricks, but also different tools to help you get to where you need to be faster and more efficiently. Were there any tricks, any tools that you use that are especially helpful in doing a documentary?
I have to say the use of script sync when I edit is just like a godsend, because for all the organization in the world, there's just sometimes when you need to be able to like just trace down like a subject matter or you know, an emotional word, you know, a damn or whatever, just to kind of, you know, to find your way through it. And that's something that I use endlessly. Actually, prior to that, Peter would, you know, at certain points in the edit would suggest areas of the transcript, and it became a running joke that obviously with the aid of script sync that I'd maybe put that process out of business slightly because I was just finding stuff faster than him. He'll probably hate me for saying that, but yeah, that one, man, script sync, because obviously like everything has to be transcribed before you start a documentary. You know, watching faces is like critical to documentary filmmaking and storytelling, and like, you know, tracing emotion in the way that people's delivery and transcripts don't give you that. But there are a time when you need those transcripts to be able to just quickly fly through what it is someone said without just double timing or whatever, you know.
Yeah. Well, going back to the balancing act that you all had to do with before the accident and after the accident, the movie is officially titled Superman, the Christopher Reeve Story, but it also spotlights some really amazing bits of heroism from his wife, Dana, who basically kept him alive. I mean, after the accident, he said, you know, I just didn't think maybe I wanted to go on. And she said, you're still you. I love you. So through her own will and determination and sacrifice, keeps the family going, keeps him going. And then less than 2 years later, after he passes, succumbs to cancer herself. Again, he's the headline. It's about his life and the people he loved. But you want to spend some time with Dana and her life after Chris. And that has to be something you considered pretty carefully. You know, she's such an integral part to his story and the key to so much of what they accomplished together. So you got to give her a due there at the end, because she is such an important part of all of this.
We really did have to. I mean, Dana was the most extraordinary person, and obviously her work for the foundation after Chris died, and, you know, Chris's work for the foundation, his foundation was his legacy. And obviously after her passing, you know, they changed the name from the Christopher Reeve Foundation to the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. It's the Christopher and Dana Reeve Paralysis Act that, you know, Barack Obama passes again after both their passing. And, you know, their children, you know, their children are their legacy. They're amazing children. There probably, you know, may well have been a school of thinking that the film is about Christopher Reeve, and, you know, once Chris is no longer in the story, you know, what do you do? But with the timing of it, with the effect that it had on all of the children, we had to embrace the fact that we were going to have, for want of a better expression, 2 deaths at the end of the film, which was going to be very hard to navigate in terms of the up and down nature of it, but it has to still feel like it's kind of relevant to the story. It posed a big challenge, but it felt so important. And there was many versions of that part of the film, and obviously the subsequent coda, but we had to. She's just like the most extraordinary person, you know?
Well, obviously they're a part of the process, his children, because they're featured in the film. They're aware of how it's going to some degree, but was there a first sort of official screening for them that you did? And what was that like? And what kind of feedback did you get from them?
I've said it before, but I should say it again. You know, the children waited a long time to talk about this, but they've said themselves they went for the right filmmakers, and they, you know, they loved Peter and Ian, they loved Misfits, they loved Passion, and they felt like they were the right partners to kind of, you know, make the film with and to give over their archive to. They weren't involved in the editorial at all. Obviously, we did have a screening for them so they could see the film together for the first time. And I have to say, I was feeling good about the film, but obviously I was like naturally nervous as the filmmaker, because like you're trying to condense but also celebrate and, you know, live in the ups and downs and the, you know, very like dramatic nature of their father's life, you know. And like, you know, I know if someone had done that with my own father's life, like I would be like nervous watching it, right? So I was nervous, but they all really loved the film. They really enjoyed it, and they kind of just told us to kind of keep going. You know, it was really near the end of the process. There wasn't any like kind of editorial decisions that were made beyond it, but like there was a screening where we wanted their blessing and their support, and fortunately we got it, you know.
I tend to like to ask editors at the end of these interviews what they took away from the project in terms of personal growth or just things they learned about their craft. What do you take away from this film?
You know, I should probably say that, you know, I became a father not that long ago myself. So I've got one kid who's 4 and one kid who's 2. So it's like, it's early days. But being able to craft Chris's journey as a father was like a privilege. And obviously there's like ups and downs in it. And, you know, that there just are as a parent. And I think that's something that I definitely took away, was like, everyone makes mistakes, and like I make mistakes every day and all the rest of it. But I think that's probably something in terms of like personal growth, was just like the appreciation of the role of a father, to listen and to, we're all busy, right? And it's like, it's very difficult sometimes to put your own self aside when you're, you know, you're at the coalface and you feel like you're doing the most important thing in the world when you're making a documentary, but like that your family is like the most important thing, you know. Not to say that's what Chris did, but like that's just one thing that I've taken from it. And professionally, probably to try and work with Peter and Ian again as soon as possible, because whenever we work together, it's just so much fun, you know.
Well, you make a pretty good team. And I think that's a great answer to close out on. And I can't believe it's been since January since we've spoken, and this movie has gone on such a journey, just like Christopher Reeve himself. He just doesn't give up. It keeps fighting for more time. So congratulations to you on that.
Thank you.
And I'm just thankful we're finally able to do an interview indoors. So
yeah, definitely less windy than the last time.
Well, there you have it. Superman, the Christopher Reeve story. It's a fantastic film. Watch it alone with a box of Kleenex. Unless you're not a big baby like me, then you can watch it with whomever you like. But watch it. So much to learn about Mr. Reeve's story, and lots to learn about making a documentary that is a movie. Thank you to our intrepid friend Otto Burnham for taking a chance on me back in Park City, even though he should have wondered, who is this strange man accosting me on the street? You're all right, Otto. Thanks for the time. You know, time is a precious thing. Way more valuable than money. You can make money. Making time is a lot harder. In fact, you can't. You can only make better use of it. That's why many a fine editor chooses Avid Media Composer as their primary editing solution. Why? Well, for one thing, it does a lot to help you save that time that I said was so precious. If you've got faster, more precise editing tools, you're saving time. If you've got advanced, AI-enhanced speech-to-text tools like ScriptSync and PhraseFind, you're saving time finding those incredible nuggets that make up your story. If you've got streamlined interop with Pro Tools, the industry-leading digital audio workstation, you're saving time. So don't waste any more time just thinking about it. Start your editorial journey with the same system that Otto and pretty much every other editor on this show uses to tell their stories. And you can do that by getting on over to avid.com/MediaComposer, or just click the link in the show notes I gave you. Look, I saved you some time. Well, I hope you liked revisiting this little story from Sundance. I certainly liked having the opportunity, the second chance, if you will, to explore one of these Sundance films. If it's okay with you, I think we'll do it again. Perhaps next week. Who knows? Until then, this is Matt Feury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.